Welcome, everybody, to this afternoon panel discussion with the University of St. Thomas Master of Fine Arts Program in Creative Writing. I'm going to say a few words about burgeoning traditions in just a minute, but there's one tradition that we have in the MFA program, and that's to begin things with prayer. And we have a wide variety of prayers that we use because we're clever. But the one prayer that has really established itself as a tradition is this prayer from Flannery O'Connor's prayer journal. So we'll start with that. In the name of the Father. Wait, go ahead and bless yourself. The Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. I need reading glasses, though. Okay. Dear God, I cannot love thee the way I want to. You are the slim crescent of a moon that I see, and myself is the earth's shadow that keeps me from seeing all the moon. The crescent is very beautiful, and perhaps that is all one like I should or could see. But what I am afraid of, dear God, is that my self-shadow will grow so large that it blocks the whole moon, and that I will judge myself by the shadow that is nothing. I do not know you, God, because I am in the way. Please help me to push myself aside. I want very much to succeed in the world with what I want to do. I have prayed to you about this, with my mind and my nerves on it, and strung my nerves into a tension over it, and said, "Oh God, please, and I must, and please, please. I have not asked you, I feel, in the right way. Let me henceforth ask you with resignation, that not being or meant to be slacking up in prayer has a less frenzied kind, realizing that the frenzy is caused by my eagerness for what I want and not a spiritual trust. I do not wish to presume I want to love. Oh God, please make my mind clear." Glory be to the Father, to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. So thank you, everybody, for joining us this afternoon. It's great to have you all here. And I said at the outset, I spoke of traditions, and I'm especially pleased that this is now the third year in a row that the De Nicola Center has graciously given our program, the Master of Fine Arts program at the University of St. Thomas, the opportunity to hold a panel discussion on the subject of literature in the religious realm. And so we're hoping that this will be the third of many, and we're most pleased for it to be here with you today. When the title of the annual conference came out, it took about 5 seconds to know what we had to talk about. I came across, snooping, don't tell her, and my daughter, this phrase. She said, "Maybe I'm just haunted dust." And I thought, haunted dust, a haunting of dust. This is a perfect expression of one of the central problems that literature confronts us with, and that literature, I think, helps us overcome. So I'm going to offer a few preliminary remarks about that, and then we're going to have each presenter will offer some separate remarks, and then we're going to have a panel discussion, and then we're going to open things up for questions. Before I make my remarks, though, let me introduce our speakers in order. So speaking second today will be Jane Clark Scharl, who is an American poet, playwright, and critic. She serves as seminar manager for the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, and her first verse drama, Sonnet les Matins, was published by Wise Blood Books in February 2023, and her debut collection of poetry is forthcoming in 2024. Wait, what did I do? Oh, you held up the book. Okay. She lives in Detroit with her husband, who's a Michigan fan, unfortunately, and 2 children. But we are hoping eventually to be able to stage that play in Houston. It's a play dialogue with John Calvin, Rabelais, and Ignatius. Mm-hmm. Yes, verse play. So think about that. That sounds really promising. Okay, so speaking third will be my colleague at St. Thomas, Joshua Hren, who's the founder and editor of Wise Blood Books. and co-founder of the MFA program in creative writing at the University of St. Thomas in Houston. He's the author of 7 books, which includes the novel Infinite Regress and the book Contemplative Realism, a theological aesthetical manifesto, which those of you with very good memories will recall was the subject of last year's panel discussion. In fact, we thought that all of our panel discussions were basically just going to be responding to books that Joshua had published, but we broke the streak this year.
Thank you to God that ended.
His second novel, which was largely composed in Mecosta, Michigan, was called Blue Walls Falling Down, is forthcoming in 2024. And then speaking fourth is our good friend and a candidate in the MFA program at the University of St. Thomas in Houston, Paul J. Pastor. Paul is a poet, award-winning writer, and occasional critic, and serves HarperCollins as senior acquisitions editor for their Zondervan imprint. He's the author of several books, most recently Bower Lodge Poems, and is presently completing a second collection of short poetry and The Fire Cantos, a book-length cycle on the spiritual implications of wildfires in the American West. He is, as I said, a candidate in the MFA program at the University of St. Thomas, and he lives in Oregon with his wife, Emily, a professional oil painter, a very talented one, and their 3 children. So that's our lineup. I wanted to just start with a few introductory comments, prompted initially by an offhanded remark I heard made years ago. The novelist William Giraldi, in my presence, once said that philosophical materialism has everything to recommend it, except when you're trying to write a novel. Now, we may want to quibble over the first part of that, and let's do it by looking at the second part first. So, when I think of philosophical materialism, I always return to Thomas Hobbes, because Hobbes gave the first great attempt at a genuinely systematic account of what it would mean for the world to be nothing but matter and motion. He reduces the world and all of its contents to matter and motion. And then he says we can know the world by a process of reasoning that's grounded, he thinks anyhow, in this material premise, and the process of reasoning, I'm not going to go into all the details, is, as he puts it, more or less a process of addition and subtraction. You add names together to get a sentence, you take names apart to make distinctions. And he says, if I'm recalling correctly, there are 6 ways in which you can fall into absurdity in this addition and subtraction process. My favorite one is the 6th one, where he says, using words like transubstantiation. You know, once you do that, you're already in absurdity. But the 5th one, if I'm recalling, I forget the exact phrasing, but the gist of it is all metaphor is specifically excluded. Okay? Metaphor has no place in reasoning. But then, in discussing the intellectual virtues, and you Aristotelians will know, or Thomas anyhow will know, you know, that when we think of intellectual virtues, we think of things like understanding, reasoning, and wisdom. Or we can expand the list if we want to go back to Aristotle, but those are the 3 that Aquinas focuses on. They're truly intellectual virtues because they're ways of knowing the truth. Hobbes, because he's Hobbes, couldn't just have intellectual virtues be about how we know the world. No. It's got to be about how you survive in court. So to this plus and minus of reasoning, in that process, he says that there are 3 intellectual virtues that emerge. The first is wit or fancy, and that's the capacity to take names that seem not to have anything to do with each other and to put them together. The other is judgment, which is the ability to tell when names are not the same or not equivalent, and you separate them. The third is discretion, which is to know the limits of fancy and judgment, and this is where the court part comes in. The long and the short of it is that discretion is the intellectual virtue that teaches you when to shut up so you don't get beheaded. Right? So he says discretion is really essential, because if you're someone who's prone to fancy, to putting names together. You need to know how to trim the sails of your speech. Otherwise, you'll seem as if you're possessed with a kind of madness. And Hobbes is very clear to argue that we can't be possessed by madness, that there's no such thing as possession. That's one of the things that he gets rid of in his materialist reduction. So that means you're just crazy, right, if you seem possessed. Wit or fancy he defines as follows. Men's thoughts move in swift succession over all things, and those with the intellectual virtue of wit will observe in the movements of thoughts in what they be like one another. That is, they observe their similitudes, especially those such as are rarely observed by others. This rare capacity, of course, is what makes fancy a virtue, because, as Hobbes says, if all things were equally in all men, nothing would be prized. It's our first materialist and our first capitalist. So, as Hobbes continues his discussion, we quickly find that wit and fancy have a prized place, but only in poetry. This is in Leviathan. Only in poetry or other forms of speech that stand apart from reasoning. In reasoning, in contrast, judgment holds sway, not fancy. So the ability to tell things apart, not to put them together, almost exclusively. He does qualify this, however, by saying, except sometimes the understanding has need to be opened by some apt similitude. And then there is so much use of fancy. But he continues, but for metaphors, they are in this case utterly excluded. For seeing they openly profess deceit, to admit them into counsel or reasoning were manifest folly. Okay, so I want to make two observations about this claim. Fancy helps us do something, and it has a prized place in poetry, but fancy is otherwise to be excluded for reasoning, except insofar as you make not a metaphor, but a simile. So here's the first observation. Hobbes' chief criticism in Leviathan is of superstitions. And in fact, the best passages in Leviathan, I don't know if Michael Moreland's here, but years ago, Michael Moreland, who was chairing a panel the other day, he wrote me when I had said something slighting of Hobbes, and he said, Hobbes has a great prose style. And that's true in places, and especially in those lists of the innumerable gods of the Gentiles, or lists of superstitions that people come up with. Those lists are really good, but they're lists of things, all things that Hobbes thinks are false, right? And what he's doing is trying to get rid of the superstitions. The Leviathan is a project in disenchantment. It's a school in disenchantment, in fact. He's trying to teach you all the things that you shouldn't believe in so that you only believe in matter and motion, and then can add names together using his materialist logic. Yet Hobbes does not want everything disenchanted, or at least not entirely. Again, he reserves poetry as this distinctive place where fancy, which we would normally exclude or say you're crazy for saying that, it can roam freely. Extravagantly, in fact, in the sonnet or the epic poem, as long as it's within the bounds of discretion, that third virtue. This is not as trivial an exception as it may seem. Oh, you can't do this except for in poetry. That's okay, because we don't care about that. That's not quite what he's saying. Hobbes says directly in the preface, well, a response to a preface he wrote for the epic poem Gondibert. He says that he himself was incompetent in poetry, and he proved it because he wrote a verse autobiography in heroic couplets. All right, that was a joke, and nobody got that. Okay. He did, however, provide a short essay, as I said, in response to this epic poem, Gondibert, and there he gave us some thoughts on poetry in general, and particularly with regard to this faculty of wit or fancy. Here's the quotation. So far forth as the fancy of man has traced the ways of true philosophy, so far it hath produced very marvelous effects to the benefit of mankind. All that is beautiful or defensible in building, or marvelous in engines and instruments of motion, whatsoever commodity men receive from the observations of the heavens, from the description of the earth, from the account of time, from walking on the seas, and whatsoever distinguish the civility of Europe from the barbarity of the American savages, is the workmanship of fancy, but guided by the precepts of true philosophy. But where these precepts fail, as they have hitherto failed in the doctrine of moral virtue, there the architect, fancy, must take the philosopher's part unto herself. So he just went from what in Leviathan says fancy is this okay thing to do in the little sonnet's plot of ground, now, in fact, is the engine of wit that drives all construction of everything marvelous or beautiful that constitutes civilization. All right? So what he's just excluded from reason is actually what builds up civility in its entirety, what we would call civilization and culture. And then that last paragraph is hard to parse, but what he's basically saying, and it's in reference to the poem that he's writing in response to, is that when philosophy fails to teach true morality, when the moral philosophers fail, the poet must step in and do the philosopher's duty. Okay? So fancy, wit, suddenly builds up all of human culture and civilization and also teaches men to be moral. It's not a joke. That's a substantial claim. I think that the famous Nasty, Brutish, and Short passage, if you pay attention to the words there, and I don't have them here with me today, you can see that Hobbes' concern with the famous state of nature and the breaking out of anarchy is not reducible just to people in fear of the danger of their lives. One of his central concerns is actually not just that we can keep ourselves alive, but that we can make good things, that we can build beautiful buildings or stronger structures rather than hiding out in caves with a slingshot aimed at all the time. So, and in fact, I was reflecting on that. I was reading James Madison last week, and I was thinking how Madison on copyright and intellectual property law, really, it seems to almost come out of Hobbes. That Hobbes is concerned not just that we can be safe of our lives, but that we can build up these structures that he's just described with such enthusiasm. So he cares about civilization. It's not just a pretty thing for the ladies or something like that, okay? Sorry, was that sexist? All right, it's not sexist. He's the sexist. Okay, all right, so, all right. You're the, okay, all right, you can accuse me of that later. All right, so it's by fancy that civilization comes into being. Like Giraldi, Hobbes recognizes that the likenings of fancy barred from everyday reasoning nonetheless must operate in the work of art. But then he suggests something more. It's out of the virtue of fancy that the artifice of civilization is built. Fancy exists not just in the poetic world apart, but builds up the human world. It's as if he's anticipating Napoleon by 100 years, that imagination rules the world. Great. So if we stopped there, we could say the following. Hobbes thinks that reality is just bare matter in motion that can be known by reason, but there's this pretty stuff we can build on top of that bedrock for which we need fancy, the capacity to make metaphors and similes, the poetic imagination, to put it broadly. But here's the other thing. He also says that in reasoning, it's okay to use not metaphors, but similes in order to illuminate a point. And I'm just very sarcastic right now when I say, where could we go for an example of this use of fancy? Where might we find something like that? How about to the very first sentence of the Leviathan, Hobbes' book? There, Hobbes tells us that nature is the art whereby God hath made and governs the world, and must itself be imitated by man, who then makes the artificial animal of the state. But then he writes the following. So not first sentence, first paragraph, excuse me. Seeing life is but a motion of limbs, the beginning whereof is in some principal part within. Why may we not say that all automata, engines that move themselves as springs and wheels, as doth a watch, have an artificial life? For what is the heart but a spring? And the nerves but so many strings? And the joints but so many wheels, giving motion to the whole body. If you accept this first paragraph of the Leviathan, everything that follows the next 400 pages is true. His adding names together is very systematic and careful. I mean, you can make some quibbles, but for the most part, once you buy the first paragraph, you've bought the book. But look what this first paragraph says. The premise is that reality consists of matter and motion. That premise, that first premise, is entirely unargued, except insofar as it uses that simile, that act of fancy, to justify itself. So in order to accept that only matter is real, you have first to stand apart from the kind of materializing reason that Hobbes uses and accept as having argumentative value a poetic simile, which means that Hobbes's argument could be true that only matter and motion is real so long as we can stand in a position that's apart from matter and motion and judge it in poetic terms rather than the material terms that he offers. So this is a very different Hobbes from the one I pronounced to us at the outset. Not only is Hobbes telling us that we need poetic fancy to build up the human world of civilization and of morality, but in fact, against his will, he's showing us that his whole material argument doesn't work except on your accepting a poetic premise as its first principle. So that says to me that even in this most cynical and crabbed account of the poetic imagination pushes through and says, not so fast. I was delighted to read this last fall Jeremy Begbie's new book, Abundantly More, The Theological Promise of the Arts in a Reductionist World. And I thought about just doing a book report on that. But rather than continuing, I thought we'd see how far we can push poetic fancy by hearing from these other speakers.
I don't think I could have gotten a better introduction than that. That was wonderful. Let me just get my timer going. So yeah, I love that we've already established here that within art, we're at the center of a conflict between the material world and the spiritual world. And for my villain, I'm not going to pick on Hobbes, I'm going to pick on Descartes. So I want you to keep in mind that we today are living in a world that's been this distinction that Hobbes makes, where he says we must live in this material world. The other world doesn't exist. Descartes doesn't go that far. He doesn't say it doesn't exist. He just says we can't get there. There's an unbridgeable chasm. So I want to look today at a particular 20th century poet named David Jones. He's the greatest modernist poet. And I hope that comes back up because I'll defend it rigorously. But Jones gives us a vision of how art, even today, even in our mechanized age, even as we are losing contact with the material world and with the shaping of the material world that is our human inheritance, even today, art offers us a path and a bridge over the Cartesian divide between the mind and the body. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. So David Jones gives us a vision of mankind as maker. He says that us as maker, as shaper of the material world, that's part of our identity as Imago Dei. So he writes in an essay called Art and Democracy that you should all read. It's short and absolutely marvelous. But he writes, all men are created equal in the sense that all are creative beasts. So we all make things. That's what makes us distinct from animals. And he goes on, the more man behaves as artist, and the more the artist in man determines the whole shape of his behavior, the more is he man. So by artist, we mean form maker. Someone who sees this material world, someone who takes the sensory inputs and shapes them and makes of them not just meaningless conglomerations of stuff, but makes them signs. And when we say sign, we mean a thing that is both fully itself and more than itself. Now, many of us are Catholic, all of us are liturgically minded. Something should pop into your head here of something that is fully itself and at the same time more than fully itself. And that would be the Eucharist. So we'll come back around, but the Eucharist is the sign of signs. That is the shape and summit of our sign making as a race. So how do we get to the Eucharist. We'll get there in a minute. But we make these forms, these signs that point beyond themselves out of a gratuity. This is an excess. Jones goes on to say that if a beaver, in making a dam, laid one twig that was outside what was necessary for the retention of water, one twig that was laid purely for an aesthetic or a gratuitous purpose, that beaver would have transcended animal nature and become Imago Dei. Because the beaver is incapable of viewing his dam as a gratuity. He sees it as a function, and the function can have beauty. It is a beautiful thing to see a functioning beaver dam, but to see a beaver dam that not only functions, but is also crafted in waves or shapes or has a portrait on the outside, that's beyond our imaginations, because animals don't function that way. Humans function that way. Humans take the material world that Hobbes talks about and make it more than it is. So through our making, through our sign making, we participate uniquely and continually in the redemption of the world. We take the material world and we offer it up as a sign, and in that sign making we pull in that which is beyond the material world, and it becomes a cycle where we offer the sign, the non-material reality enters into the sign, rejuvenates the sign, and then we re-offer the sign. And that's where we can see there's a liturgical function to this sign making, where we do the same thing over and over again, but it is a continually renewing act. Now, if this seems strange or abstract, I want you to think about making bread in your home. It's a continual process in which you take flour and you take water, you combine them, you put them into the oven. Now, if you're a real baker, you want that to be a beautiful loaf of bread. It's not just a squished blob. You shape it. You use your little bread spade and you shape the thing, and you do this over and over and over again. For much of human history, humans did that act, that artistic, creative, gratuitous act of shaping beautiful loaves of bread every single day, over and over and over again. And the bread became a sign. When Christ says, "I am the bread," that already means more than I am something you eat to stay alive. Bread had already become a sign of home, of civilization, of sustenance. And then Christ takes this human sign and makes it an a supernatural sign. But the sign of bread as a created thing that we make, that means more than itself, that already existed when Christ came and took it. And we think about, God calls us to this over and over throughout history. So the Israelites made their own temple. God gave them instructions. They wove the curtains. They found the gold. They made the tabernacle. And then hundreds of years later, they made the temple. God asks us to bring our made offerings, our shaped signs, and to give them to him so that they can take on that supernatural meaning. So for us, he asks us to bring the bread and the wine, and then he will make his body and blood. But if we stop bringing the bread and the wine, if we stop making bread, God will stop coming to us in the Eucharist. Our making is an essential partnership in the restoration of the world through the Eucharist. And we can see in this that making is a habit. It's something that we have to habituate ourselves to. Just as Aristotle says we must habituate ourselves to virtue, we also must habituate ourselves to thinking as makers. We look at our world as raw material that we can shape into potent signs, or we can neglect. We stand in a moral relationship to the world, to the sensory world. We will either cultivate it into signs that have meaning, or we will neglect it, and the signs will collapse and we will not have meaning. Today, we are in an interesting position, because how many of us actually make things in our lives? We have given over the task of making in many profound ways to machines. And that puts us in a really difficult position. And Jones actually is working from that space. He's writing in the 40s and 50s, and he's seeing this shift from man as maker to man as consumer. And that may seem like an economic and a political problem. Well, guess what? It's actually a moral and an aesthetic problem. At its basis, our shift from maker to consumer is an anthropological, moral, and aesthetic problem for us, and we do not know how to solve it yet. So that's why I'm only going to talk for a few more minutes, because I can't solve it today. But hopefully we can start thinking about it together as a community. Because, okay, so think about, here's an example. Think about the hosts that we elevate. These used to be made by people in the community. A woman would take flour and water in her kitchen, put them together, bake them. She had to learn how to do this, by the way. It's really hard to make something edible out of just flour and water. It's actually difficult. I don't know if any of you have ever tried. It's hard to make something your throat can actually swallow because it's so glutinous and gummy. So she would have to learn how to do this. Then she would bring her offering to the church. The priest would take it, and that would be hallowed. Now, even better, take it back a step. Her husband had planted the wheat, had harvested it, had ground it. So when she knelt to receive the Eucharist on her tongue, she was receiving not something made by a machine or by something, because I know there are many communities of nuns that make hosts, but something made away from her, something that she couldn't see. She was receiving something that she herself had participated in making. So the sign of God, was something that she and her family and her community had brought together, and the transcendence came through her. We obviously don't live in that world anymore. So with this loss of connection and participation in the sign making, it leaves us in a strange situation because we use these signs, but they're beginning to lose their power because we aren't feeling the movement from material to transcendent sign back to material to transcendent sign that has marked human culture ever since we started making cultures. So Jones reminds us that the artist, who is all of us, remember, even if you're not an artist, you are a maker. You work, you are a craftsman. That is what you are. You are making signs. The artist, the sign maker, deals wholly in signs. His signs must be valid. That is valid for him and normally valid for the culture that made him. So as we make signs, we make cultures and we make ourselves. So art is not just me sitting in my room writing poetry. Art is every time that I make something and offer it as a community, as a bridge across the material world and the transcendent world. Every time I defy that Cartesian barrier, I am an artist. So I'm going to give some examples of what that means because it can all seem a little bit abstracted at this point. Baking bread is a great one. Next time you need a cross, make it. Even if you have to make it out of popsicle sticks. Make it. Practice putting that conjunction and feel with your own hands what happens at the corners of things. That's a material reality, a juncture that when we feel it with our bodies and we participate in bringing it, that actually changes our spirits. It changes our souls and the way that we think about other times we see that shape in the world. And it might seem strange, but it actually matters. Make your next rosary. Feel the beads as you string them. Just buy beads, that's fine. You don't have to learn how to lay round things, but make your next rosary. Just string the beads. Icon makers do this all the time. They're kind of the last of the real makers because they understand that as they make, they pray. Their making is a prayerful action. All of us can do that throughout our days because we are all artists, we are all makers, but we don't get to participate in making very much anymore. We have to battle even to participate in this element of our human nature. Next time your kid needs a Halloween costume, make it for them. Make them a ghost costume out of a pillowcase because guess what? If they watch you take a pillowcase and cut it and then they become a ghost, guess what's happened in their imagination? You have cemented the relationship between death and sleep in their imagination. They will always feel death as a sleep and sleep as a death. That's a powerful sign you've just given them without having to do anything besides just cut some holes in a pillowcase. But now it's in their minds that life is but a waking, death is but a sleep. And you can work with that later as they grow. But these are little tiny things. You could buy the ghost costume or you could make it. And think about your life in terms of making, and how as you shape your world, you are bringing meaning back to signs that, I hate to tell you, these signs are on the verge of death. If you talk to a practicing artist, they will eventually say, I don't have things that are sticky. We're running out of sticky stuff. We're running out of words that resonate with a large group of people and grab your imagination. So like the sign of the moon, okay? So when Chaucer writes about the moon, he's got an entire mythology associated with the moon. The moon as the guardian of the border between the angels and the devils, or the moon as the sign of the, it's marking out the edges of different levels of spiritual reality, okay? So when he says under the moon, there's so much in that phrase. It tells you we live in a haunted world. That's what he's saying. But we don't have that sign anymore. When we say under the moon, if we're lucky, someone's going to think of werewolves. If we're lucky, we'll get some werewolf action. But we're not going to get that sense of living below the ether, living in the realm of the Prince of Darkness. We won't get that stickiness in your imaginations. So the artists don't have signs, and that's because we're not making them from the ground up. So I can talk more about this in question and answer if you want more ideas for how you can do this in your actual day-to-day life. But I want to read you a poem by David Jones before I close, because I think it's kind of the cry of all of our hearts in this age of we're watching things automate, and we're feeling this part of our identity as maker, it's slipping away. We're losing it. And this is what David Jones wrote in the 60s. This is part of a poem called Ah, Domine Deus. I said, ah, what shall I write? I inquired up and down. He's tricked me before with his manifold lurking places. I looked for his symbol at the door. I have looked for a long while at the textures and contours. I have run a hand over the trivial intersections. I have journeyed among the dead forms causation projects between pillar and pylon. I have tired the eyes of the mind regarding the colors and lights. I have felt for his wounds in nozzles and containers. I have wondered for the automated devices. I have tested the inane patterns without prejudice. I have been on my guard not to condemn the unfamiliar, for it is easy to miss him at the turn of a civilization. That's where we live. And we are desperately looking for the signs that have heft and that can overleap that barrier between the material world and that which is beyond the material world. But they're out there. So that's our challenge. We live at a time where the true signs are losing their force. That doesn't mean the signs are meaningless. It just means that they don't have force in our imaginations because we haven't cultivated them. So I am very practical, and I want to encourage all of you today, find your nature as a maker and embrace it. Make things. Try to make a sign that will bring something from beyond the material world into the material world and back out. And I can give you more examples in our Q&A, but look for resonances and breathe new life into signs that feel like they're dying. And that will help us create a culture that can read the signs. So then when we speak, when artists speak, there's a resonance. There's a music that comes from it. So thank you very much.
Probably the most important thing I'll tell you is that Jane's book is available in the bookstore, a couple rooms down, and I've been able to determine with fairly good degree of accuracy that it also is a very efficacious fan. Because I thought for a second that I was in the wrong panel. I thought that we were doing a historical reenactment of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego because of the heat in the room, but I guess we are in the right place. So James had discussed, to kick us off, William Giraldi's remarks about the novelist being the one for whom, even if he is a philosophical materialist, the creation of persons presents a problem. And that sentiment is echoed by Harper's editor Christopher Beha when he says that the novelist is a person for whom secularism presents a problem. And one example of this I'd like to take us through today is a new novel. It's about a month and a half old by J.M. Coetzee, and it's called The Pole. It is what I would describe as an uneasy secularization of Dante's love for Beatrice. And I emphasize the word uneasy. But that Dante's purged and paradisial desire could become the stuff of earthbound pleasures as it does in this novel is not surprising as it might first seem. As Eric Auerbach argues in Dante, Poet of the Secular World, the Italian exile's most essential innovation is that perfection appears as a sensuous reality. That is to say, perfection is consummated in the persistence of personhood in the figure of Beatrice, in the afterlife. The flesh and blood Beatrice, the Beatrice of dust, is haunted and transfigured and transformed while preserving her earthly form. Auerbach goes on to argue that this has widespread implications. Humankind's essence could only be discovered by way of his final destiny. So if you've read the Divine Comedy, you know that there's an awful lot of talk about what's going on down on earth, right? More than you would suspect would be happening in paradise and in purgatory. You'd think that they would be focused on God alone. But Auerbach makes us aware that Dante digs into this connection between man's concrete earthly life being always and everywhere encompassed by his eternal fate. Right? So everything that he does on this earth, even if it's of infinitesimal importance, even in that infinitesimal degree, has supernatural, divine consequences and implications. So what happens then when a novelist touches this myth and tries to secularize it, as Coetzee does in this new novel? Well, what happens, there's another way of asking this question, is what happens for our legacies and for our personhoods if the eternal is eclipsed? In The Pole, Beatriz, B-E-A-T-R-I-Z, the protagonist offers what she calls her mature and adult belief at one point in the novel, and she says she does not believe in life after death, except in the most metaphorical of senses. When she is dead, her children will remember her and reminisce about her fondly or not so fondly. They might also pick her to pieces with their psychoanalysis. As long as they go on doing so, she will enjoy a flickering kind of life. But with the passing of their generation, she will be tossed into a dusty archive, there to be shut out from the light of day forever and ever. Her metaphor for a this worldly afterlife is about as demystified as it gets, but it also has a kind of connection already with what St. Bonaventure describes in Journey of the Mind to God as the human memory being a figure or an image of eternity. So she's already beginning to grasp the connection between the persistence in an afterlife and the act of human remembering. Throughout this novel, Coetzee conducts a number of different inversions of the original and sublimated spiritual tryst between Dante and Beatrice, whereas her namesake was the incarnation of faith in the Divine Comedy. Beatrice, in this novel, does not believe in God. Whereas Dante irradiated his chaste, courtly love through a sweet new style, a refinement of the troubadour's courtly love verse into a poetic idiom that pulsated with passion and reached its pinnacle in the mystical lovesickness that he experiences, the Polish pianist in this novel, whose name is Witold, which seems to be something like old wit told in reverse, plays Chopin with what's described as an austere manner that leaves Beatrice deeply disappointed. He's also much older than her. So whereas Dante is a little bit younger than Beatrice, in this case, he's an older man and Beatrice is a middle-aged woman. Coetzee also seems to counter the original myth through his spare style, the very, very spare style of the novel, which starts out with a series of numbers, and you probably can't see it if you're as blind as me, but basically there's just numbered sections, and the first one is literally one sentence, and it says, "The woman is the first to give him trouble, followed soon afterwards by the man." And this reminds me a little, his style in this novel reminds me a little bit of what James Wood describes as Muriel Sparks' devoutly starved style. So it's almost like an intentional, devoutly starved paring down for most of the novel. But then there's a departure from this devout starvation, because after Beatrice falls for Witold, and unlike Dante, who gazed at Beatrice chastely, she actually invites him to her husband's childhood summer home and offers herself to him sexually. So unlike in the case of Dante and Beatrice, they consummate their attraction sexually. And fascinatingly, what Coetzee seems to suggest is that because they consummated that desire sexually and because they did not sustain the chaste, courtly love of Dante, after the Pole dies, after Witold dies, he leaves behind some poems that he wrote for her. Now remember that she begins by thinking of the afterlife as this metaphorical bureau, basically, a demystified sort of anathema of a filing cabinet, basically. Now, when the Pole dies, she finds out about it, and she goes to his apartment in Poland, and she finds, for one thing, that his family clearly did not take any efforts to take care of him. They have left his ashes in a kitchen cabinet that she stumbles upon and is terrified and sort of asks someone to please take it away as quickly as possible. But then she also finds in that house some manila folders filled with poetry. Now, in one of the great ironies of the novel, the only translator that she can find is someone who's well-versed in legal documents, and so she, there's a little bit of uncertainty in terms of whether the poetry really is as bad as the translator makes it appear to be, but it's really bad. It's really bad poetry. So there seems to be a suggestion there that, again, because they made their love more illicitly carnal, there's a loss of the muse's efficacy, and he leaves her just with this afterlife of a folder, which is exactly what she conceived of the afterlife as being. Now, it's at that very moment in the novel, at the very end, where she says, she's thinking of heaven as a vast anteroom full of souls milling about in their uniform smocks, searching anxiously for their other halves. And this mode of thought is completely foreign to her. She's never even given an inch to the idea that the soul might persist. But precisely because he has left her these poems, she is so moved by it, even though they're bad, that she begins to not only remember him, Remember, because memory, according to Bonaventure, is the image of eternity. So she begins not only to remember him as a kind of figura of the afterlife, but she can't help herself from speaking to him and writing letters to him, right? So what I want to suggest is that it is this, the persistence of his personhood, right, for her is animated by her memory, but then perfected by these poems that he leaves. And she treats him as if he still exists, as if he's still alive, as if he can hear her. Now, if that wasn't already enough of a reversal, a few pages from the end, she writes this, and I'm conscious of time, and so I'm going to just leave out a couple of things and just end right here. She says, because he's been promising her, we'll meet again in the afterlife. And she says, this is just romantic nonsense. Like, there's no such thing. Stop promising me this thing that you can't fulfill. And she says, does it occur to him that they might fail to meet in the afterlife? Not because there is no afterlife, but because fate will have consigned him to the basement realm, while she floats above in paradise, eternally unattainable. And then, if you can see on the page, there's a break, and then she asks the question, or the reverse. It's an extraordinarily powerful moment where she moves from having no faith in the afterlife to believing that it does possibly exist, and then in her first version of it, consigning herself to paradise and him to the inferno, and then at that very moment, asking maybe the reverse is the case. The next line, Coetzee describes, her conscience goes off like a bomb, is the way that he puts it. And this is a really remarkable metaphor in a novel that's as subdued and spare as this one. And this awakening again of his personhood in the afterlife that moves her to contemplate her own destiny ultimately pricks her conscience enough to make her begin to question the morality of her affair and the entirety of her life. And I'll leave with that just again in the interest of time. Thank you so much.
What a joy. Such an honor to be part of this panel and an honor to be in all of your presence. Thank you for coming and to be here and share this time with us. By way of title, what I'd like to say here, we'll call Inside Hands, George MacDonald's Curdy and the Cleansing of the Creative Soul. But really what I want to do here is not present you merely with a set of ideas, but to give you 3 key images to walk away from during our time. I'll mention those in a moment. But as I was sitting there, I was reminded of the British comic book writer Alan Moore, who is a thoroughly corrosive personality, but very wise in an upside-down sort of way, who said that all writing is essentially a form of magic. It's the manipulation of human consciousness by means of symbols. And it's a not coincidental thing that spelling is also spelling. And so by being in the presence of these images today, I'm very conscious of the weight of what we do. So contrary to Hobbes, fancy is not something that sits upon the top of human life. Each of us in this room very likely could think of a moment where a story, or a metaphor, or a movie, or something someone said in passing entered your imagination at a soul level and shaped you. I can't think of a better definition than magic for that. The movement of our consciousness by means of symbol. So what I'd like to talk about is 3 things that I think we all ought to bear in mind as we go forth from this room into all sorts of diverse scholarship, work, family life, as something that can help us, both on a philosophical level but also on a practical level, engage in this work of magic in a way that is faithful to the mission of Jesus and that is good for ourselves, that does not end up destroying us. Because we know from all the old true fairy tales that the person most in danger from any kind of magic is the magician. 3 images for us. I'm going to do little hand gestures. You're welcome to join me, but I do volunteer with our children's liturgy. Three images for us. The breathing throat, outside hands and inside hands, and the rose fire. Let's talk about these. First, the breathing throat. Many of you likely know that in the biblical literature, Bible is written in 2 ancient languages, Hebrew and Greek. We all know this. You're all smart. But the Hebrew concept of soul is that we translate as soul is the word nephesh. And it's a really interesting word. It basically just means neck or throat. Esophagus would be a really good translation. But the basic image that's held for us in that is of a body that is respirating. Taking breath in, breathing breath out. Taking it in, breathing it out. The moment we hold that image, there's an entirety of truly beautiful resonances that arise. We think of the chaos of creation in the very first chapter of the book of Genesis, where the ruach, the spirit, the breath or wind of God moves over the chaos and then speaks. For the Hebrew imagination, nephesh was a category of breathing beings. A dog or a cow was a nephesh. It was a soul because it breathed. A fish was not. A worm was not. But humanity was unique and distinct from the very first chapters of Genesis because we are the only nephesh that can shape our breath. I can stand up here and speak to you. I could sing to you, though not perhaps very well. And I could even name you if I was given the authority to do so. Many of us have named children. That is not something a dog does or a cow does. It is something God does. And in this, we experience the Imago Dei in a very unique way. Because unlike the angels, who imaginatively, we might say, their bodies correspond to an element of fire, our bodies correspond to an element of earth, of clay, of dust. We are speaking mud, singing mud. And as we breathe and incarnate the Ruach, the Spirit of life, we're doing something nothing else in the whole structure of creation can do. Hold that image in your mind. Now we move to the concept of outside hands, inside hands. And this is where we'll move to George MacDonald in just a moment. But first, let's notice something, that the same interiority of spirit that any of us can have extends beyond just the individual human to groups of humans, so that it can be said that an institution, say the university we are now, has a spirit of its own sense. Like the ship of Theseus. If you replaced all the faculty and all the buildings and all the students here, something of Notre Dame would remain. And we can say that that has a spirit. A nation might have a spirit. The spirit of America is different than the spirit of Canada or the spirit of Mexico, right? And we immediately can see that there are complexities here. The Apostle Paul, or the biblical literature, would call these the powers or the principalities. And the good news of the gospel is that Christ Jesus has led them all in triumphant procession, Paul says. He's conquered them, because these are by no means all clean for us to work with. They're very dangerous, very powerful, but they're human extensions of the realities of the humanity. And so the nature of us as a breathing throat of a nephesh becomes complicated in the world, in the practical world. Blessing and cursing are both possible with that shaped breath, and that blessing and cursing extends not just to us as individuals, but to ideologies, to institutions, to traditions, to nations. We see immediately the implications here. Like Socrates says in Plato's Symposium, the soul is like a chariot pulled both by a dark horse and a light horse. And right at the moment you feel it rising up to encounter the beauty of the divine, oh, that dark horse just pulls you straight down to the earth again. Because of humanity's gifted dominion of the earth, which was intended to be a gift, us serving, us giving, us naming, that dominion turns upside down. We can become curved in upon ourselves, to use Augustine's concept of sin, the incurvatus in se, right? And that same process by which we would have blessed, we curse. What we might have named with truth changes in our mouth to a lie. And instead of life, we get death. Instead of a culture of life and institutions of life, we get cultures of death and institutions of death. Purging is needed. We'll get to that in just a moment with the rose fire. Cleansing is needed. But this concept brings us to George MacDonald and his work, The Princess and Curdie. Many of you may have read The Princess and the Goblin. George MacDonald, of course, is a Victorian writer. C.S. Lewis said that reading one of MacDonald's early works baptized his imagination, and that Lewis felt that he had crossed a great imaginative frontier when he picked up a little copy of Phantastes in a train station. The Princess and the Goblin is a very kind of garden variety fairy tale. It's nice. It's very pleasant. There's this kingdom and a little miner boy named Curdie and a little princess named Princess Irene, and these mean goblins from under the ground want to like tunnel under the castle and kidnap the princess, right? Coming up from below. Nothing psychological going on there. The Princess and Curdie is very different. If The Princess and the Goblin was this book of childhood, The Princess and Curdie is a book of adolescence. It begins with the key figure actually like killing a bird for no reason other than just to try. I actually did this as a little boy. I was like maybe 7, had my first slingshot. And it still is one of like the true regrets. Like it's one of my great sins. A little bird sitting on a power line in Helvetia, Oregon. Oh, well, I know what I'll do, I'll try. And then it's gone. You feel this sense of great violation, like, oh man, you can't make that thing live again. Like there's something that's gone really wrong. And so it starts with that moment for Curdie. He kills a pigeon and ends up in the logic of fairy tales, climbing this sort of abandoned tower in a castle and finding a woman who's neither really old nor really young, representing Lady Wisdom. And it was her pigeon that he killed. She takes it, she heals it, and then begins interaction with him that's really quite interesting. She says that, for Curdie, that everyone has outside hands and inside hands. There's the appearance that you can see, and then there's the reality of the soul that is reaching out through those inside hands. And she takes Curdie, and she leads him to a fire of roses, heaped roses. It's such a memorable image. It literally gives me goosebumps. And they're burning. And in the course of this conversation, she asks him to trust her, and then she tells him to put his hands in the fire of roses. And he does it without even thinking. He knows that if he thinks about it, he'll be scared, so he can't think about it, and he plunges his hand into the fire of roses, and it hurts. It hurts so bad. It's agony. It's burning his hands. And then it almost becomes tolerable. And then it actually feels sort of good. And as he draws his hands back out of the fire, they're not charred and blackened, but the rough exterior and the calluses of being a hardworking miner boy and the coal stains are burned away, and he sees his true hands for the first time. Now, what Curdie doesn't know is that in that, the plunging into the rose fire, which is this beautiful image of purging, has given him a gift. Because the kingdom, unbeknownst to him, is in a great danger. The king is being deceived. The institutions of state and church and industry have surrounded themselves deceptively and are, instead of serving the people, they're using the people. They're dominating them. The blessing that they could have given has turned to cursing. And the gift that Curdie has received through the rose fire is the gift of feeling people's inside hands. So it's a strange thing. But when he goes up and he shakes, like, hi, John, how are you? He feels the heart of the person. And sometimes it's the belly of a snake, and sometimes it's the hoof of a pig or the paw of a dog, and sometimes it's the hand of a child. The story moves towards a kind of dark conclusion, but also a quite satisfying one, as this entire army of what MacDonald calls uglies, which are monsters from the depths, snakes with feet, and weird, horrible elephant dogs, and all these just monsters, but who all have little child's hands in their souls, come up, enter the world where everything looks just fine, but the souls are twisted, and fight a great battle. What I want to recommend to your attention in the last couple seconds that I have here is the idea that each of us in our work are constantly interacting with spirits as this breathing throat, as this nefesh. And one of the things in our materialistic, reduced, impoverished culture of signs and of images that we've discussed so eloquently here with my fellow panel members, one of the things that's so hard to do is to know what you can trust. How do I know, if appearances look so good, what is happening in the soul? And I would recommend to you this thought, held in the image of the rose fire, that beauty is what purges us and restores to us our sense of spiritual sense and instinct. That holding ourselves, sometimes painfully, in the presence of great art, great literature, great architecture, great conversation, the beauty of nature, that as we return to that, we are, as it were, plunging our hands in the rose fire and being cleansed. It takes choice, but it will restore to us a gift. The ability to more accurately and truly discern what it is that we are touching when we touch any of the human realities of academia, of industry, of culture, of social media. So in the rose fire, we are purged. We are given the gift to be able to then work honestly for the sake of others. And what I believe is the ultimate promise of these three images is that under the lordship of Christ, we can return to that first and most beautiful creation or calling of our species, to be the breathing throat and to praise and speak and write and work and tell stories and name in the most gracious and generous form of holy magic. Thank you.
I really wanted to spend the next half an hour arguing about David Jones, but
I knew you would.
since time will not allow that, why don't we just open things up to questions?
Hi. I was wondering if I could maybe push back against you poets a little bit on this. And specifically, Miss Jane Scharl, I mean, I was reading in the Bible the part about the building of the temple and recently, and Solomon actually hires somebody else to do a lot of the artwork. I mean, he hires this Hiram of Lebanon, I think, to do most of the work. I mean, I definitely see your point about human beings, that being an imitation of God doing work, but I mean, and that's, recognized in John Paul II's Laborem Exercens, but I think that, we also imitate God in other ways, in terms of, in the fact we have an immortal soul, in the fact that we can reason and contemplate. I mean, and so there's always like the two sides to it, and there's always that, work should be a part of your life, but leisure and contemplation and all the stuff Pieper talks about also needs to be part of it too.
I don't exactly know what the question is. Do you want me to just kind of respond to that?
Sure.
Okay, no, I think that's a great point. I think the idea that making is always work, that would be a misunderstanding. A lot of this making is leisurely. It's what we would do in our leisure time. So, for example, something that we do for fun in my friend circle is we read plays together, Shakespeare, or we just get together and we read a play. That's a making, because we've made a space and now we are using our words to make, we've created a mini culture. So instead of just sitting and in isolation and consuming something, instead we've made something. So I'm glad you brought that up, because definitely making is not always confined to the commercial realm. It's definitely a leisure activity, but it requires us to give something of ourselves. Leisure shouldn't, and you know this, you've read Pieper, leisure's not a taking. A good leisure is it's a reciprocal activity. Does that help clarify anything? Okay. Good question, thank you.
Let me just say one thing on that. In the same period that David Jones is writing, in the essay that Jane's referring to, he speaks of man as homo faber, as man the maker. And this is the same period that Bergson in Creative Intuition, it speaks of homo faber as the ultimate degradation of the human person. And I think that needs to be nuanced out just a little bit. That man the maker for Bergson is just is the loss of man's dignity. And I think to Jane's point, what Jones emphasizes is the gratuitous sign, the sign that's beyond utility, that shows forth the human person.
Hey, how are y'all doing? I'm Ted, and I'm from Benedictine. I love hearing about Dante, one of the kind of great makers, and someone who's able to kind of take his work and lift it up to God. And something that I love about his work is that each word and even the location of the words has so much meaning behind it. I was wondering if there's any kind of modern works that kind of are able to recapture that. And I know that it's kind of you were saying, one of the waning skills that we have right now. But is there kind of anyone besides maybe a Tolkien that has been able to recapture that you would recommend reading?
Well, yeah, are you just asking for the best poet living right now? Is that basically the question?
Yeah, I'm still an undergrad, so I'm still used to homework. So any other reading that you might suggest?
I mean, James is really good. I'm not just saying that, he's actually really good. Yeah, right. I mean, if you ask certain people, nothing good has been written since The Wasteland. I don't know if Matthew Walter's here. It's been an ongoing discussion. What do you guys think? Who would
So
you?
the last part in terms of Dante, the last part of Michel O'Sheill's 5 quintets is amazing. I mean, putting that one guy in heaven before he was dead, and then the revelations about him after he died are kind of soiling that part of the poem. But don't ever put people in paradise before they die. That's otherwise your poem won't last. Dante, put some popes in hell before they died, but that was as read. So, but yeah, Michel O'Sheill's 5 quintets, and he has a new book out, Testament. That's good. When I hear that, I want to. Who do you think is the novelist who has a grand stage? Don't say Dante's Indiana.
I think we're waiting for that writer in terms of the novel form. But I think that there's a much taller task, because, as I was talking about the Coetzee book, he's probing into the afterlife, but by means of kind of speculation and suggestion. And so it's just the case that the modern novel does not take its protagonists into the entirety of the cosmos and the Imperium, and that's why so many novels in the infancy of the form end with deathbed conversions, right? For example, or deathbed scenes are hugely important, because that's the kind of the form tends to take characters to the threshold. But I do think, rather than naming a particular recommendation, I mean, I can think of someone like, I would actually say someone like Cormac McCarthy actually gets quite close to doing what we're describing in novel form. Took me a bit to latch onto that, but I think that instead, I would like to defend the goods of the novel as a form, even though it doesn't do the same thing that Tolkien and the enchanters do. Because I think that actually it does, Flannery O'Connor says the harder you look at reality, the more you look at mystery, and the more you look at mystery, the more you know of reality. And so even the modern novel, which is typically a realist form, does touch on mystery. It's just going to be through indirection and subtlety and implication rather than through a kind of direct enchantment. And I actually think that it's harder to do in some ways than the direct form of enchantment that you find in Lord of the Rings or Chesterton or the classics like the Chesterton industrial complex of Catholic culture. You know what I mean? So, thank you. No, there's nothing wrong with Chesterton. I think he's oversighted in conservative Catholic cultures, appreciated at the expense of other forms and writers who are doing really good things.
We'll do one last question with one, and only one quick response to it.
Hello, thank you so much. I really appreciated this talk. I'm going to ask two questions. The first one is quicker, the second one is also quick, but it may lead to longer response from you. As a Dante scholar, I loved, Joshua, what you were presenting. Now I really want to read this novel and either pick it apart or to destroy it or fall in love with it. So just going from your presentation, just one simple question, and then I'll ask my other one, is did you like the novel?
I think I actually struggled with it in the beginning because of the sparsity, and as I mentioned, what he seems to be, dramatically embodying in these opening pages is almost like, can I reduce the person? Can I almost strip characters down to such a kind of mundane form of prose that it's almost dead on arrival?
Okay.
And that was a real challenge for me. But then I started to understand that what he's actually dramatizing is the haunting of dust, right? So he starts trying to do that, but then he fails to do that. I actually think I did really appreciate the novel by the end, and I didn't mention this, but even things like that might seem on first glance a little bit untoward, that are kind of remarkable touches in, obviously, in Dante's Paradise, right? The mystical rose is the final stage, right? That all the souls are buzzing like bees from one petal to another in worship of God. And in the novel, there's so many of what I want to say is there's so many of these reversals, but they're actually illuminating reversals. It's not just like clever, tricksy stuff, like Smeagol or something tricksy. By the way, if there are parents in the room, this is a parenthetical, but don't let your children be exposed to Smeagol at too young of an age like I did, because now my son just basically is the form of Smeagol. So I would definitely say, like, just wait until they're 12, not 2. But okay, so really quick to
You answered his second question before you
No,
could
not
ask
yet, actually.
But yeah, so real quick, I would say, so one of the most amazing reversals is actually that after they consummate the affair, he in his first poem that he leaves her, he describes her private area as a rose. And it's just an amazing via negativa way of showing what happens when the carnal is so overemphasized and cleaved to at the expense of the cosmic, right? So.
Yeah, well, thank you. That was beautiful. So my question for all of you through that, just Dante populates all of hell, purgatory, paradise with people from his own society, which is kind of insane if we were to do it today, 700 years from now, where would we put Jeff Bezos? Where would people, like all these different things that I've thought about. But in what way, as poets, like what I'm thinking about is not the society of the world that the poet finds him or herself in, the fertile soil that gives, that plants the seeds through their writing. And I'm wondering, in this way, how are you as poets? Do you see yourselves as engaging civically? It's not just creating literature, but rather it's a political act. In the same way that Dante did it, Petrarch did it, Boccaccio, Machiavelli as well. I do Italian literature, but yeah, there are the English Romantics as well, and Hobbes as well. So I'm just wondering.
Could I just say really quick? I think that there can be a kind of a distasteful dilettantism that artists can sometimes embody, and I appreciated actually Chris Wolf's question for this reason. I think that artists tend to overemphasize the importance of beauty in and of itself, kind of as separate from the civic or something like that, or as if it's superior to all these other things. I think that's a travesty. I'll just say really quickly, in the novel that I'm publishing next year, one of the protagonists is basically very active in a radical political movement that's something like Black Lives Matter, and there's another character, the woman who they have a tumultuous affair, and then she goes home to live with her parents, and her father, in the meantime, since she's last been at home, has started basically holding kind of alt-right militia meetings in his basement with his grade school friends. So that's a very obviously direct engagement with politics, but the novel is nothing like what I just described it, actually. It has, what I just described almost has nothing to do with the novel. So sometimes, right, the way in which the art addresses the political is again, through a slant.
Yeah, I'll just say really quickly that writing is a lot like learning to drive a car. You will end up hitting or running into what you look at. And so the worst way to write something important is to overthink it. And if you set out to write the civic evisceration of our time, or you try to imitate Dante, your stuff's going to be unreadable. And I am going to send you a very politely worded rejection letter when you submit it to my press. But gazing upon, I mean, you know, if Dante wasn't looking at the Empyrean, he wouldn't have been able to write something so bound to the moment in which he lived, and yet that we're still talking about today. He was able to transcend it because his gaze was on that. If you look at the ditch, you'll drive in the ditch. If you look at the brick wall, you'll drive into the brick wall. But if you look just at the edge of the horizon where the road goes and the sun's setting, and you're like, I want to go there, odds are pretty good you can stay on the road. All right, we crashed.